How exactly does a child end up covered in paint and in a fight, and no one thought to call me sooner?
Mrs. Adebayo, I promise we're sorting it out right now. I'm so sorry. Whatever my boys did to your daughter, please let me make it right.
Your sons humiliated her.
Let's discuss this calmly. I'm so sorry. Whatever happened, please let me make it right. I'll cover the cost of the uniform and anything else that needs sorting out.
Do-yun, you don't have to do that. Thank you. I appreciate you saying that. It's just been a difficult day.
I understand completely.
Neither of them knew it yet, but a ruined uniform and a schoolyard scuffle between their children were about to become the reason two guarded, single-parent hearts finally found their way toward each other. If you love stories about second chances, found family, and the kind of love that grows slowly instead of all at once, subscribe and turn on notifications. A new cinematic love story drops every week right here on Afterglow Tales. Now, let's go back to where it all began. Kang Do-yun had built a name for himself in Seoul's competitive logistics industry through sheer discipline and an almost stubborn refusal to accept failure as final qualities that had served him well in business, and that he would need more than he ever imagined on the morning his sons were born. His wife had complications during delivery that no one had anticipated, and by the time Ji-ho and Ji-won took their first breaths, she had already taken her last. He remembered very little of those first weeks clearly, only the fog of grief layered over the terrifying, practical urgency of two newborns who needed him regardless of whether he was ready. Family offered to help and did for a time, but Do-yun made a quiet decision early on that he would raise his sons himself, primarily fully, not out of stubbornness alone, but because some part of him needed to prove to his wife's memory as much as to himself that he could give these boys everything they needed. The years that followed blurred together in the particular way exhausting, love-filled years do. School runs and fevers, bedtime stories read in a voice roughened by fatigue, business calls taken in hallways outside pediatricians' offices. He built his company into something genuinely respected during the same years he was learning to braid. Well, he never quite mastered anything requiring braiding, having sons, but he learned everything else a single father needed to learn, and learned it without complaint. By the time the boys turned 9, Do-yun had become, by any outside measure, remarkably successful at the singular, exhausting project of raising them alone. But alone was the operative word, and it weighed on him more than he let anyone see. Least of all his sons, who he suspected, correctly, understood far more about his loneliness than he'd ever intended them to notice. Do-yun had tried, over the years, to give his sons a mother again, not out of any impatience with single fatherhood, but out of a genuine, aching hope that they might have the fuller family he believed they deserved. Each attempt followed a similar arc. A woman he'd grown to like, an introduction handled as carefully and gently as he knew how, and then, without fail, some quiet campaign of resistance from Ji-ho and Ji-won that escalated until the relationship simply couldn't survive it. Sometimes it was small. A spilled drink that seemed accidental until it happened 3 dinners in a row. Homework suddenly requiring help at precisely the moment Do-yun sat down with a guest. Other times it was considerably less subtle. Car keys disappearing, a woman blamed for messes she hadn't made, whispered comments designed to make a guest feel unwelcome without ever quite crossing into anything Do-yun could directly punish. He had tried talking to them about it more than once, sitting them down with the patient, careful tone he used for anything genuinely important. "Don't you want me to be happy?" he'd asked them gently, the first time it happened. Ji-ho, always the one to answer first, had simply shrugged and looked away, while Ji-won stared at his hands, saying nothing at all. An answer of sorts, Do-yun had come to realize, even if neither boy could yet articulate what actually lay beneath it. He suspected, without either son ever saying so directly, that their resistance had nothing to do with any particular woman and everything to do with a fear neither of them had the words for yet. The fear that loving someone new somehow meant loving their mother less, that any woman who filled her chair at the table was, in some childish but devastatingly real logic, erasing her a little further. Understanding the reason didn't make the pattern any less exhausting, or any less heartbreaking, but it kept Do-yun from giving up entirely. Even as, privately, he began to wonder if he simply wasn't meant to try again. Folake Adebayo had come to Seoul for her university studies with plans that, at the time, looked nothing like the life she eventually built. She had fallen in love during her final year with a fellow student, a relationship that felt, for a while, like exactly the kind of steady partnership she'd hoped her 20s might eventually produce. When she discovered she was pregnant, she told him with the nervous hope of someone expecting difficult news to be met with support rather than abandonment. He offered neither. He denied the pregnancy outright at first, then simply stopped answering her calls entirely, leaving Folake to face the remainder of her final year, including her most demanding examinations, entirely alone, carrying both the pregnancy and the particular grief of loving someone who had shown her, with brutal clarity, exactly how little she'd actually meant to him. She finished her degree anyway, with grades strong enough to surprise even her own professors given her circumstances. Sheer determination carrying her through examination halls when everything in her body and heart might reasonably have told her to give up. She gave birth to her daughter, Temalawa, shortly after graduating, and made a private, unshakable vow in those exhausted, tender first weeks of motherhood that her daughter would never once feel the absence of anything Folake herself could provide. She built her career in Seoul methodically over the following years, taking every opportunity available to a determined single mother with a strong degree and no safety net beyond her own persistence, until she'd established herself firmly enough to give Temalawa genuine stability. A good apartment, a good school, a mother who arrived at every parent-teacher conference and every school event without fail, whatever it cost her personally to be there. Men who showed interest along the way found themselves met with a guardedness she made little effort to disguise. She had already learned, thoroughly and painfully, exactly what trusting the wrong person could cost her. Temalawa, Temi to everyone who knew her well, had grown up entirely in Seoul, fluent in Korean, comfortable in the rhythms of the city her mother had built their life in, and yet always carrying a quiet awareness of being visibly different from most of her classmates. She handled it, for the most part, with the particular resilience children raised by strong single mothers often develop early. Proud of who she was, quick to defend herself when provoked, and fiercely loyal to the handful of friends she trusted completely. She attended one of the better elementary schools in her district, the same school that, coincidentally, Kang Do-yun's twin sons attended a grade above her own year. A coincidence that meant nothing to either family until a fine arts class one ordinary Tuesday afternoon changed the trajectory of both households entirely. Temi had, that particular week, been looking forward to the class more than usual, having spent considerable care assembling a painting she was genuinely proud of, working on it during every free moment the assignment allowed. She wore, that day as most days, one of only 2 spare uniforms her mother kept freshly pressed for her, practical, well cared for, but not easily replaced without real inconvenience to a mother managing a household budget with careful, deliberate discipline. It was during the cleanup at the end of that class, brushes being rinsed and palettes wiped down in the general chaos of 9-year-olds handling paint, that Ji-ho, reaching carelessly across a shared table for a jar of water, knocked over an open container of vivid red paint directly across the front of Temi's uniform. An accident genuinely, though one that would set in motion consequences neither boy could have anticipated. Ji-ho stared at the spreading red stain across Temi's uniform with the particular horror only a child fully registers in the seconds after realizing they've done something that can't be undone. "I'm sorry," he said immediately, reaching for a nearby cloth, genuinely apologetic despite the accident's carelessness. "I didn't mean to, I swear." Temi looked down at the ruins spreading across her front, one of only 2 uniforms her mother could easily afford to replace, and felt something considerably more complicated than simple childish anger rise in her chest. A flash of the particular unfairness she'd learned early to recognize and resent, the sense that some accidents cost some families more than others, whether or not the boy responsible could understand that difference. "You should be more careful," she snapped, her voice sharper than she'd intended, embarrassment and genuine worry about her mother's reaction tangling together into something that came out as pure fury. Ji-ho's apology, genuine as it was, did little to soften her in the moment, and she stormed off toward the school nurse to see what could be salvaged, leaving both twins standing amid the paint and the wreckage of what had, until 30 seconds earlier, been an entirely ordinary afternoon. The teacher, occupied elsewhere in the classroom's chaos, hadn't witnessed the spill directly and simply noted the mess for cleanup without connecting it clearly to any particular disagreement. A gap in adult awareness that would matter considerably by the end of the school day, once Temi's simmering anger found its outlet in a plan that would, through a case of mistaken identity, escalate an accident into a genuine confrontation. Temi spent the remainder of the school day quietly rehearsing her revenge, waiting for the break period when she knew she'd have the clearest opportunity to even the score. She'd noticed only one of the identical twins clearly during the paint incident. Ji-ho had been the one directly beside her, but in the general blur of matching uniforms and identical faces, she couldn't reliably tell the brothers apart from any real distance, a mistake that would prove immediately embarrassingly costly. She found Ji-won alone near the courtyard's far wall during break, confidently certain she'd located her target, and doused him without warning from a water bottle she'd filled specifically for the purpose, only to watch his face shift from confusion to genuine anger as he realized what had happened, having done absolutely nothing himself to provoke it. "What was that for?" he shouted, grabbing her wrist as she tried to step back. And within moments the confrontation had escalated into a genuine scuffle, shouting and pulling, neither child backing down. Ji-ho, spotting the commotion from across the courtyard, sprinted immediately to defend his brother without pausing to understand the full context, and within seconds all three children were tangled together in a heated, chaotic fight. Exactly the kind of scene that drew the attention of a teacher on courtyard duty, who hurried over and physically separated the three of them with practiced, firm efficiency, demanding an explanation none of them were particularly eager to give. The teacher, piecing together the fragmented, overlapping accounts each child offered, eventually understood enough of the situation to require all three to remain after school for a proper explanation to their parents, a requirement that would, within the hour, bring Kang Do-yun and Folake Adebayo into the same room for the very first time. Folake arrived at the school considerably more upset than she usually allowed herself to appear in public, the sight of Temi's ruined uniform triggering a familiar, exhausting frustration about the particular unfairness of raising a child alone on a budget that couldn't easily absorb replacing school clothes on short notice. She was midway through a pointed question to the teacher about how, exactly, this had been allowed to happen when Kang Do-yun arrived, having been called moments after Folake herself, his expression carrying immediate, genuine concern rather than any defensiveness on his son's behalf. "I'm so sorry," he said, before the teacher had finished explaining, addressing Folake directly with a calm, steady sincerity that caught her slightly off guard in the middle of her building frustration. "Whatever happened, I want to make it right. Please, let me cover the cost of the uniform and anything else that needs sorting out." Folake had braced herself, without quite realizing it, for the kind of dismissive, minimizing response she'd occasionally encountered from other parents in situations involving her daughter, reflexive contradictions, or that this was somehow being exaggerated. Do-yun's immediate, unreserved accountability, offered without hesitation and without a single word of excuse for his sons, disarmed her considerably faster than she expected, her anger softening into something closer to cautious surprise. "Thank you," she said finally, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. "I appreciate you saying that. It's been a difficult day." "I understand completely," he said, and something in the quiet, unforced empathy of his tone suggested he genuinely did, in a way that went beyond simple politeness. They stood together a moment longer as the teacher finished outlining what had happened between the children, both parents listening with the particular attentiveness of people trying to understand not just what occurred, but what it might reveal about the children they were raising. The following morning, both parents arrived at the school gate within minutes of each other, an accident of timing that felt, to both of them privately, considerably less accidental than it probably was. After their children disappeared through the gates, walking separately still, though without the open hostility of the previous day, Do-yun and Folake lingered a moment longer than either had strictly planned to. "I wanted to properly apologize again for yesterday," Do-yun said, and Folake found herself smiling despite her earlier resolve to keep the conversation brief and businesslike. "The boys have been talking about it all evening. I think they feel genuinely bad in their own way." "Temi too," Folake admitted, though she'd never say so directly. "She's stubborn like that." She paused, then added with a small, testing smile of her own, "Would it be strange if I said I'm glad it happened? I don't think we would have properly met otherwise." Not strange at all, Do-yun said. I was thinking the exact same thing. They exchanged numbers before parting that morning, the exchange handled with a casual ease that belied how significant a step it actually represented for two people who had each, in their own separate ways, grown considerably guarded about exactly this kind of possibility. Over the following weeks, brief morning pleasantries gradually extended into longer phone calls in the evenings, then into an easy daily rhythm of messages exchanged throughout the day. Small updates about the children, small observations about their respective days, the particular gentle momentum of two people discovering, gradually and without either forcing it, that they genuinely enjoyed each other's company far beyond what the original incident had required of them. Their first proper date, arranged several weeks after that morning at the school gate, took place at a quiet restaurant Do-yun had chosen specifically for its unhurried atmosphere, wanting the evening to unfold without pressure or performance. Folake arrived slightly nervous despite herself, having not properly dated anyone in years, though the nerves settled quickly once their conversation found its natural rhythm. They talked, over the course of that long evening, about the particular circumstances that had shaped them both into single parents. Do-yun describing his wife's death with a grief that had softened into something gentler with time but never fully left him. Folake speaking of her own abandonment with a directness that surprised even herself, having rarely discussed it so openly with anyone since it happened. Neither flinched from the other's story, and neither offered the kind of shallow, reflexive sympathy that so often felt more like discomfort than genuine understanding. I think, Folake said at one point, studying him across the table with a searching, careful attention, you might actually be the kind of man I've been telling myself doesn't really exist anymore. Someone who takes responsibility without being asked to. Someone steady. I could say something similar about you, Do-yun replied. I've met plenty of people who talk about strength. You've actually had to live it every single day for years without much choice in the matter. That's a different thing entirely. By the end of the evening, both privately, separately, concluded something neither said fully aloud that night, that whatever this was becoming, it was worth pursuing carefully, deliberately, with the same patience each of them had learned to bring to every other difficult thing in their lives. As the weeks passed, what had begun as a cautious, exploratory connection between Do-yun and Folake deepened steadily into something both of them recognized, with growing certainty, as genuine feeling rather than simple convenient companionship. Their calls grew longer, their meetings more frequent, each conversation adding another layer to an understanding that felt, to both of them, considerably rarer than anything either had experienced in years. Their children, meanwhile, remained stubbornly unmoved by their parents' growing closeness. Ji-ho and Ji-won still regarded Temi with the wary distance of the courtyard fight, and Temi, for her part, made little effort to disguise her own lingering irritation at the twins, avoiding them deliberately in hallways and refusing any group activity that might place them together. None of the three children knew, in these early weeks, that their parents were seeing each other at all. Do-yun and Folake had agreed, without much discussion needed, that they preferred to build the relationship carefully before introducing that complication into their children's lives. Do-yun noticed the ongoing tension between his sons and Temi with a particular private worry he didn't yet share with Folake, aware that whatever grew between the two of them would eventually have to survive contact with three children who currently showed no signs of moving past their mutual grievance. He said nothing yet, hoping, with the same patient optimism that had carried him through years of single fatherhood, that time alone might soften what direct intervention likely couldn't. Believing, reasonably enough, that a shared outing might help thaw the lingering tension between the children, Do-yun and Folake planned their second date as a family outing to a nearby park. A decision that reflected genuine good intentions but underestimated considerably how far the children's rivalry still had to travel before anything resembling friendship might take root. The outing began pleasantly enough on the surface, though the children maintained a careful, deliberate distance from one another throughout, speaking only when directly required. During a stretch when Do-yun had excused the twins to use the restroom facilities near the parking area, the boys instead slipped toward Folake's parked jeep, Ji-ho producing a small tool he'd brought specifically for the purpose, and began letting the air out of one of her tires. A plan hatched in whispered conversation the night before, driven by the same anxious, unspoken fear that had fueled every previous sabotage. Temi, who had wandered toward the parking area separately, spotted them mid-act and stood frozen a moment in genuine shock before her outrage overcame her surprise. "What are you doing?" she shouted, loud enough to carry across the lot, immediately running to find her mother rather than confronting the boys directly herself. A choice that would prove more consequential than she likely intended in the moment, transforming a childish act of sabotage into a genuine crisis for both families. Folake arrived within moments to find her tire visibly flat and her daughter pointing, furious, at the twins, who stood frozen with the particular guilt of children caught in an act they'd known, even as they did it, was genuinely wrong. Folake's first instinct, standing beside her damaged tire with her daughter's outrage still ringing in her ears, was a familiar, exhausted certainty that this relationship, however promising it had seemed over these past weeks, simply wasn't going to survive contact with children this determined to sabotage it. She said as much to Do-yun, her voice tight with frustration rather than genuine cruelty, as he arrived to find the scene unfolding. "I understand if you need space," Do-yun said quietly, absorbing her frustration without defensiveness, before turning immediately and deliberately toward his sons rather than toward Folake. Crouching down to meet them at eye level in the particular way he handled anything genuinely serious with the boys. "This isn't about whether you like Temi or whether you like anyone I bring around. This is about you choosing, deliberately, to hurt someone who did nothing to you. That's not who I raised you to be. Do you understand me?" Both boys, faced with their father's calm but unmistakably disappointed tone rather than anger, found it considerably harder to maintain their usual defiant silence. Ji-won, always the softer of the two, was the first to crack, tears welling as he mumbled a genuine apology, and Ji-ho, after a long moment of visible internal struggle, followed with his own considerably more reluctant apology to both Temi and Folake. Do-yun insisted over the following days that the boys personally repair the situation, earning money through extra chores to cover the tire replacement themselves rather than simply having their father quietly fix it, a consequence he felt mattered considerably more than any lecture alone could accomplish. Folake, watching this unfold over the following week, found her earlier certainty about ending things softening considerably in the face of exactly the kind of responsible, values-driven parenting she'd hoped, without fully admitting it to herself, that she might eventually find in someone. Several weeks after the tire incident, with an uneasy but genuine truce having settled between the children in place of open hostility, Temi found herself cornered during a break period by an older boy from a grade above, known throughout the school for targeting kids he perceived as easy, isolated targets. He'd chosen his moment deliberately, waiting until she was separated from the small group of friends who usually surrounded her, and began the kind of pointed, cruel teasing that had clearly worked on other children before her. Temi stood her ground as best she could, refusing to let her voice shake even as fear tightened genuinely in her chest. But the older boy showed no sign of backing down on his own. It was Ji-ho who spotted the situation first from across the courtyard, some instinct pulling his attention toward the scene before he'd even consciously registered what was happening, and he grabbed his brother's arm, both boys moving quickly to close the distance. "Leave her alone," Ji-ho said, stepping directly between Temi and the older boy with a firmness that surprised even himself, Ji-won moving to stand at Temi's other side without hesitation. The older boy, faced with two determined defenders rather than one isolated target, muttered something dismissive and retreated, unwilling to escalate the confrontation further. Temi stared at the twins for a long moment afterward, genuinely stunned by their intervention, the last remaining traces of her earlier resentment toward them dissolving almost entirely in that single unexpected moment. "Thank you," she said finally, quietly, and Ji-ho shrugged in the particular deflecting way children do when they don't quite know how to accept gratitude for something instinctive. "You're not so bad," Temi added, and something shifted permanently, unmistakably, between the three of them in that instant. In the days and weeks that followed the courtyard incident, the three children settled into an easy, genuine friendship that neither set of parents had dared to expect might actually take root this thoroughly. They began sharing lunch together as a matter of routine rather than obligation, comparing homework and trading snacks with the particular unguarded generosity children extend once genuine trust has replaced suspicion. Do-yun noticed the shift first during a pickup one afternoon, arriving to find all three children playing together in the schoolyard with an ease that looked, from a distance, indistinguishable from any group of longtime friends. He mentioned it to Folake that evening on the phone, his voice carrying a warmth he made no effort to disguise. "I think they've actually become close," he said. "Genuinely close. Not just tolerating each other anymore." "Temmie's been happier lately too," Folake admitted. "She mentioned the boys twice at dinner without me even asking. That's new." Neither parent pushed the development further than it needed to go, content simply to watch it unfold at its own pace, aware that whatever had shifted between the children had happened entirely on their own terms rather than through any adult engineering. A distinction that mattered considerably to both parents, who understood, each in their own way, that trust built naturally tended to hold considerably firmer than trust that felt imposed. On an ordinary Thursday evening, Do-yun returned to the school after dropping his sons home, having remembered partway through the drive that Ji-won had left an important assignment behind in his classroom. Rain had begun falling steadily by the time he arrived back at the school, and it was during his walk toward the entrance that he spotted Temmie sitting alone on the front steps, hugging her knees against the cold, clearly waiting for a ride that hadn't yet arrived. "Temmie, what are you doing out here alone?" he asked, hurrying over with the umbrella he'd grabbed from his car. She explained, her voice small with the particular embarrassment children feel when circumstances make them look more vulnerable than they'd like, that her mother had been delayed at work and hadn't yet managed to call ahead about the pickup change. Do-yun didn't hesitate. He retrieved Ji-won's assignment as originally planned, then brought Temmie along with him rather than leaving her waiting alone in the rain any longer, calling Folake along the way to let her know where her daughter was. At his home, Temmie joined the twins for dinner and homework with an ease that had become entirely natural between the three of them by now, the earlier rivalry feeling, in this moment, like something that had happened to entirely different children. Folake arrived a while later, having finished work as quickly as she could manage, and found herself standing in Do-yun's doorway watching her daughter laughing over a shared homework assignment with his sons. A sight that struck her with an unexpected, powerful wave of emotion she hadn't fully anticipated. "Thank you," she said quietly to Do-yun as she gathered Temmie's things, "for taking care of her like this. She's practically family at this point," he said simply, and the words settled between them with a weight neither of them rushed to move past. That evening, after Folake called Do-yun to properly thank him again once Temmie was finally home and settled, the two of them talked for over an hour, longer than either had originally intended. Folake asked him, genuinely curious, how he'd managed to get all three children to move so completely past their earlier rivalry, and Do-yun admitted honestly that he hadn't managed anything at all. The children, given enough time and enough small shared moments, had simply found their own way there. The months that followed deepened what had already become, by that point, an unmistakable partnership between two families quietly becoming one. Do-yun proposed several months later, in a small, warm gathering that included all three children fully in the moment rather than treating it as a private matter between the adults alone. Ji-ho and Ji-won grinning conspiratorially beside Temmie as their father knelt before Folake. The same twins who had once hidden car keys and deflated tires now practically vibrating with excitement at the prospect of gaining both a stepmother and a sister in the same joyful moment. They married soon after in a ceremony that felt, to everyone present, less like the beginning of something new than the natural continuation of a family that had already, quietly and imperfectly, been building itself for months, one accidental spill of red paint at a time. That's the story of how one spilled jar of paint brought two families together. Do you think the children's resistance was fair, or should the parents have pushed through it sooner? Let us know in the comments. If this story warmed your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who believes family isn't always about blood. Sometimes it's about who shows up. See you in the next story.